And hello and welcome to all to the event Data Innovation for Inclusive Migration and Governance, a whole of society approach. I'm Dr. Lara Susan Golosorki from the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, one of the co-organizers of this event. And we shall get started. I will pass the floor to our moderator, Brandon Fisher, to get us going. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lara. Hello and welcome everybody to the side event on data innovation for inclusive migration governance with a whole of society approach. My name is Brandon Fisher, and it is a huge pleasure to be joining you virtually from Mexico City. I look forward to engaging in a rich conversation with all of you who are participating in person and online. We're thrilled to be here with all of you for this very important dialogue. I would first like to thank the organizers of this event, Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, Samuel Hall, Clinique, Juridique, Hijra, and the Migrant Youth and Children Platform. I would personally like to thank Dr. Laura Suzanne Galasorki as well for her kind invitation to moderate today's panel. As we know, the Global Compact for Migration establishes a whole of society participation as a guiding principle, emphasizing meaningful stakeholder engagement in data collection, research, and review processes. Objective 1K specifically calls for collaboration with relevant stakeholders to develop research, studies, and surveys that inform migration governance and sustainable development. Despite progress in strengthening migration data systems, most monitoring mechanisms remain institutionally driven and fail to position migrants as co-creators of knowledge, limiting both analytical depth and inclusiveness. This side event essentially examines how participatory data approaches can operationalize the whole of society principle and strengthen a more inclusive and accountable global compact for migration review and implementation processes ahead of the next International Migration Review Forum. We have four primary objectives for this conversation, which are first, to showcase practical models of participatory data collection and analysis. Second, facilitate structured multi-stakeholder dialogue. Third, identify institutional entry points for embedding participatory data approaches and practices. And fourth, to document lessons learned and formulate concrete recommendations. In terms of the structure of the event, we have a total of 75 minutes, with my opening remarks being about 5. We will then move into 15 minutes of moderated panel discussion with our 4 panelists, actually 6 in this case. We will then open the floor to the audience here as well in person and online. I will facilitate that Q&A session, and I will close with some closing remarks. With that framing, I am very pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists who bring diverse and complementary perspectives. And I will list right away all of their bios and the topics that each of them will address, and then I will hand off to Dr. Nassim first. So Dr. Nassim Majidi, co-founder of Samuel Hall, is the co-founder and executive director of Samuel Hall and an expert on durable solutions to displacement. She has been working in Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan since 2007, and Somalia and the Horn of Africa since 2014, leading a team of researchers from the regions of study to conduct empirical and participatory research on migration and displacement. Her topic today is how participatory data approaches and practices strengthen migration governance across all institutional levels. Thank you for being here, Dr. Nassim. Dr. Younous Arbaoui is the founder and head of Clinique Juridique Hijra, Morocco. He is also an assistant professor of migration law at Vrije Université Amsterdam, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, where he leads the Global Migration Law Hub and coordinates the Migration Law Clinic. He will talk about practical pathways to meaningfully include civil society organizations in GCM review processes, ensuring that migrant organizations in particular can contribute as active partners in the GCM review process, with a focus on Morocco. Joining him in the presentation will be Melissa Drost and Alice Wong. Dr. Lara Zuzan Galasorki is an associate professor of political science and global affairs at the University of Portland and executive director of the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, a nonprofit NGO with UN consultative status. As an interdisciplinary scholar practitioner, Dr. Golazorki explores how laws and institutions shape and are shaped by human mobility and gendered hierarchies. As part of the session, she will launch the Global Gender and Migration Gender Snapshots and introduce the tool used to compile them, which is the Gender Migration Index. And Ambi is the member of the Youth Committee on Migration and Displacement Data, or YCMDD, at MYCP, supported by UNICEF EDUC, where she works on youth-led approaches to addressing migration data gaps. She is also a PhD researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute, focusing on platform-based migrant labor in the Global South, and has previously worked with the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, on migration governance and immigration policy. And B will focus on how participatory data processes and practices strengthen migration governance across intersectional lived experiences with a focus on youth and children. I will now pass the word on to our panel. Each of you will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present, 12 being the max, and I will raise my hand or perhaps open the mic just to let you know that you've reached the 12-minute mark to allow enough time for our audience dialogue. So with that said, thank you all again to our distinguished panel, also to all of you who are connected online and also in person. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Go ahead, Dr. Nassim Majidi, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for this presentation. I want to specifically thank Lara Suzanne, who has a beautiful last name. Hopefully, you'll tell us in Persian what that last name means. I'm a big fan. Spoiler alert, it means red flower, which I think is just beautiful. So now on to the discussions of the day. I'm very pleased to be here to speak to you. And let me go to the start of my slides about this central question, which will shape the next 10 minutes, is how can participatory data approaches and practices actually strengthen migration governance across levels? And in the context where I work, mainly for the past 20 years in Afghanistan, but also Somalia, Ethiopia, it's often at the local level of governance, linking that to the national and global levels that our research, our work kind of comes into play. So let me take you through some of these questions. So if we look at how migration governance is structured, of course, all of us know that it happens at these three different levels: the global, the national, and the local. We know of some of the key frameworks, such as the global compacts, that clearly call for whole of society approaches. But in practice, all of us working in the field know that there is a gap between that ambition and how the systems actually function in practice. So across multiple contexts, our research shows that cities and municipalities are where migration is being negotiated every day. The frontline responders are often municipalities working on service delivery, housing pressures, labor markets, social cohesion in contexts impacted by internal displacement, return, and other forms of migration. And yet, we also know that a lot of these needs for displaced communities or migrant communities are often underrepresented in national data systems. Local actors are expected to respond, but also lack resources or mandate to respond. And they're not systematically included as authorities, as local authorities, in how evidence is produced or used. At the same time, what we see is that migrants themselves are frequently surveyed, but they're not involved in shaping the question, interpreting findings, or defining priorities. So what we see is not just the lack of data, but a misalignment between data, lived experiences, and decision making. And this is something that we've identified, again, across Asia and Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Africa, and North Africa. And this is exactly what a lot of our research tries to do, is to really address that gap in the actual system. So what we want to do is to look at, from a data lens, at not just how migration data systems might be weak, because actually we see many migration data systems are strong, but they're strong at, for example, counting people, tracking movements, categorizing populations, fitting them in policy boxes, but they're less equipped to understand the nuances or the realities that shape how migrants experience, for example, access to services. So, for example, what we see is that data systems often don't reflect discrimination in housing, they don't reflect barriers to accessing documentation, they don't reflect levels of trust in institutions. And we know all of these are the data that we actually need to make societies more inclusive. And these are also data that local governments need. So we soon realized that actually local governance, migrants, displaced populations all face the same need, and all were asking for more participatory data processes so that they could not only shape the data that is used for policymaking, but also shape the policies and the actions coming from that data. So, together with municipal actors across the context that I just mentioned, we've set up over the last 5, 6 years what we call participatory urban dialogues in Afghanistan before the Taliban's return, and we continue to this day in East Africa through our project, which is called LEARN, which is the local leadership in East Africa on return and reintegration, and with IIED on a protracted displacement in an urban world project. And so what we did is that we set up participatory urban planning forums. So participatory processes that actually change what we define as evidence. What we realize is that evidence becomes more complete when knowledge is combined. So we as researchers come in with our data, sometimes our own primary data or data that we've synthesized from the sources available, and we use it as a way to generate a discussion between municipalities, communities, civil society to try to identify what data they come with that can complement ours, but also have them agree on what data actually matters for their city and for questions of integration and inclusion. And what we found out is that, this really shifts our data process from a process of extraction, where we just get data from people and institutions, to actual institutional learning and participatory co-design of services that are then needed. So we're getting to the point where we're not just discussing in these forums with them the data, but also the actions, the data gaps and the actions that need to be taken. So I'll just give you a few examples here of what that means in practice. So, for example, in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, which is, by the way, very close to the border with Pakistan, which means all of the inflows of forced returns coming from Pakistan to Afghanistan is impacting the city. Internal displacement is impacting the city. Earthquakes are driving displaced populations to the city. So Jalalabad is the second biggest city in Afghanistan, more or less. And it is under pressures of internal displacement and return migration. And when we had these discussions with them, with municipalities and with displaced communities, what they told us is let's sit together and all work towards cleaner, greener, and more inclusive public spaces. Now, that was a very interesting conversation at a time when the Taliban had just returned to power and where spaces for women, youth, and children were being challenged every day in national discourses. At a local level, we actually found entry points to make space for everyone in a very inclusive way. In Koboko, Uganda, the key issue there was around shifting from discussions around providing trainings to refugees to actually including them in the local market. And in Kakuma, Kenya, what we're doing is that we're working with refugees and actors who used to be involved in camp governance to actually shift the camp from a refugee camp to a municipality. This year, Kakuma is going to become a municipality. How can we help that transition be as inclusive as possible from the start? This is exactly why we've created these spaces, these participatory urban planning forums. And again, all of this is based on the principal need to include migrant voices, not just in consultation, but as co-designers of policies. We're currently involved in another research project, and I here want to zoom in on return migration, because one of the things we found out is with the very big focus, especially in Europe, but also elsewhere, on return as a durable solution to displacement. What we've actually seen is that a lot of return migration decisions are being made for people and not by people themselves. And not only that, after their return, very little of the reintegration programming is made with returnee voices being taken into account. So the data gap that we see there is, again, it's not that there's a lack of data. There's now a lot of data frameworks that have been established to, for example, measure reintegration. But what we see is whose knowledge is actually recognized and used. When we looked at all the policy and programming documents across Nigeria, Iraq, Georgia, we found that oftentimes policy debates frequently focus on data that's about readmission numbers, border monitoring, but very little about the actual lived experiences of returnees. So again, here, the focus is not just on numbers, but on lived experiences of what it means to return and who decides on return and reintegration. So I guess the call from all of our research is to move toward more equal partnerships where we can support local governments. They hold critical power, critical practical knowledge. They want to work with migrant and displaced communities. We need to support them in being equal actors of the data conversation. We need to bring the migrant refugee associations, their lived expertise in. Us as research institutions, we can bridge that conversation. We can be a bridge actor, providing evidence that's neutral, that's evidence-based, that can shape understanding and create a space for dialogue. But then we need to nurture those spaces and those conversations. And remember, the participatory urban planning process that we generated meets all of these kind of equal partnerships principles, but it's also very much rooted in Eleanor Ostrom's work as a Nobel Prize winner, her work on governing the commons. So these are global standards that, again, we're bringing to the local level. So just to finish on this slide, and again, I think we'll share all of our slides with all of you later. What I would like to highlight is, again, moving from consultation to actually co-production, building city-level evidence systems that are not just about tracking migrants and tracking numbers and having that national level data, but actually building city-level evidence systems with local data that can actually inform planning. And finally, building continuity, creating these spaces for dialogue. These are spaces that need to be nurtured through engagement. We need to have sustained platforms where municipal stakeholders, migrants, researchers, practitioners, civil society actually meet on a regular basis to discuss, challenge, and act on the evidence that's there. Those spaces exist, and I think they could be multiplied much more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nassim Majidi, for that brilliant presentation. I will save my remarks until the end for the sake of time. And we'll pass the word on directly to Dr. Younous Arbaoui, who will also be joined by Melissa Drost and Alice Wang. Go ahead. 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Brandon, for the kind presentation. And thank you for all organizers for making this event, for making it possible to organize this said event, although the difficult circumstances. So thank you, Lara, for all your efforts. My presentation, I will be talking on behalf of Clinique Juridique Hijra, Morocco, but I have also here two of my students in Amsterdam who will present another methodology of data collection in the context of GCM review. And for myself, I will talk about the methodology of Hijra, how we made it possible for civil society in Morocco to participate in the GCM review. So the focus is more on review and not on implementation. So I think this complements the presentation by our colleague Majidi, since we focus here on the review. So first of all, the gap that exists in Morocco, but also in Tunisia, and this gap is identified based on our empirical research in North Africa. is that migrants usually are viewed as data subjects and not included in the process of producing knowledge and collecting data about the GCM implementation in these countries. The GCM review is largely led by states. We see that states submit national voluntary reports to the IMRF, but that civil society, although there are submissions, they can be increased, of course. And usually in practice, what we see is that civil society organizations led by migrants are consulted very late in the process, and not from the beginning. And sometimes also in national review report, we see that state mentioned that civil society was included, but it is not totally clear how and which data exactly from the civil society which was used in the national states review. And there are structural problems in this context. First of all, if we take Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt as an example, there is no clear framework for civil society participation. It is not facilitated. It is not structured. And another problem is that civil society organizations, of course, not all of them, but the majority, rarely uses the GCM objectives and indicators in their work, in their daily work, in implementing the GCM or in monitoring the implementation. And as a result, field knowledge from civil society organizations is not translated into GCM data. It is there, the published report, but it is not framed in the language of the GCM, not framed in the language of the objectives and the indicators. And this leads us, in fact, to question the effectiveness of the GCM review process. If civil society is not included effectively, we can conclude that the review process is not effective and not independent, sufficiently independent. So in Morocco, based on this, we decided in 2023 to introduce what we call the Hijra GCM review meetings. In collaboration with the Foundation Ineligible Stiftung, we started the organization of this GCM review meetings each year, together with migrant-led organizations and other organizations, in order to meet once a year and discuss certain objectives in terms of implementation and what are the challenges faced by migrants, their real-life challenges. And together with academic experts, which also participated in these meetings, we tried to analyze the data collected by using legal language of the GCM, by using the indicators and also the actions mentioned in each objective to frame what migrants and civil society organizations tell us about the situation of migrants in Morocco in particular in the language of the GCM. So, for example, here there's some picture just to illustrate. We started in 2023. We had no funding in the beginning, so we started, in fact, only online to kick off the idea and to see how civil society would participate, to what extent they would participate, because in Morocco and Tunisia, especially civil society, the majority is still not trusting the GCM because it is viewed as a global north system framework, which in fact increases restrictive policies and not the rights of migrants. So this idea also limits the participation of certain civil society organizations. So we tried also, in fact, in the beginning of this Hijra workshops to explain that the GCM, although it has pitfalls, it has also potential which could be used in order to increase the level of protection. And then, thanks to Ineligible Stiftung, we started to organize in-person meetings each year with the same aim to discuss certain objectives with civil society organizations, with the presence of academic experts, again, which try to translate the data coming from migrants and civil society into GCM data, GCM language. And the result of this is the report, the shadow report we submitted before the IMRF to inform the discussion during the IMRF, and that's why also we participate in this event. And the report addresses certain objectives, not all the objectives, of course, but we selected the objectives on which the civil society organizations are working, so that we can use their daily work and the data they have in the review. Yeah, and in this way, in fact, we ensured their voices to be translated into the IMRF process. The main aim is to increase the integration of civil society, in particular migrant-led organization, in the process. So we think that this model could be replicated in other national contexts. Maybe there are already such concepts. But the main idea is to make it more structural, regular, and not ad hoc, and also during the coming 4 years to prepare for the IMRF 2030, so that the GCM is reviewed on a yearly basis. So this is the Hijra experience, and now Melissa and Alice will present another methodology for data collection, and then we will compare.
Hi. So, hi everyone. Very nice to meet you at this side event at the IMRF. As law students of the VU University in Amsterdam, we were tasked to write shadow reports on the implementation of specific objectives of the GCM. This related to several champion countries. In our case, it was the Philippines and Ethiopia. And in doing that, we encountered a fundamental paradox. And while it is true that the GCM is built of a whole of society principle, our data systems remained largely institutionally driven and indicator focused. This experience at the VU, our experience of writing a shadow report at the VU Amsterdam illustrates some of the limitations of more traditional desk-based GCM review methodologies. And in our projects of Ethiopia and the Philippines, students mainly relied on publicly available reports, legal documents, policy papers, and existing data sets. And this approach still produces useful analyses, but it also reveals very important gaps. Reliable and updated migration data is often very difficult to find, and in some areas, available information is fragmented or outdated or inconsistent. And secondly, desk-based research does not include the direct perspectives of migrants themselves. And as a result of that, migrants often remain objects of analyses rather than participants in a production of knowledge. When being tasked with creating evidence-based shadow reports to hold states accountable, we find ourselves in a position of systematic inability to do so accurately, because the most vital piece of evidence, which is data coming directly from migrants themselves, is missing. And as a result, migrants often remain objects of analyses rather than participants in the production of knowledge.
Yeah, and this gap that my colleague Alice talks about between official reviews and lived realities on the ground. Certain experiences, especially related to labor exploitation, Objective 6 of the GCM, and access to services, Objective 15 of the GCM, may remain invisible in reporting processes when migrants' perspectives are not directly included. The underrepresentation of civil society and migrant voices means that our shadow reports lack the operational insights necessary to challenge the status quo. Comparing desk-based review with the Hijra model is interesting. The Hijra review process involves migrant-led organizations directly in the collection, interpretation, and discussion of information related to GCM implementation. So, to move from a simulation of governance to real participation, we must embed participatory data approaches into the national review processes. And academia could certainly play a role in this. We must move beyond consulting migrants to positioning them as producers of knowledge. Only then can we create shadow reports that are truly evidence-based, moving the GCM from a document on a shelf to a living process that ensures safety, dignity, and human rights for all. The classroom and the community must become spaces of participation where the evidence is not just found, but co-created. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to wrap up, indeed, our main recommendation, my slides are not working now, but I think that our main recommendation is not really to exclude disk-based research, but to combine it with data from the field in order to ensure that the voices of migrants and civil society are included in the review process. And we think that the model, the methodology developed by Hijra could be replicated in other national contexts in order to increase the effectiveness of the GCM review process. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Younous, as well as Melissa Drost and Alice Wang for that beautiful presentation. I would just like to remind our audience that if you have questions, please, you can put them in the chat as we move through this session, okay? So I'm going to go and pass along the word directly to Dr. Lara Suzanne Galasorki. Take it away, Lara.
Many thanks, Brandon, for the kind introduction, and to all of the speakers here with us, to the co-organizers of this event, and thanks, Nassim, for pointing out what my last name means. That was a really nice touch to get the conversation started. I'm excited today for this event because at the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, we are launching the GCM Gender Snapshots. The GCM Gender Snapshots were developed over a span of 4 years, so since the last International Migration Review Forum, where we launched the Gender Migration Index, a participatory guidance tool for gender responsive and migrant inclusive policy. And so today my contribution will briefly introduce the Gender Migration Index and then showcase findings from our research using the index to compile the GCM Gender Snapshots, which is a comprehensive assessment of compact implementation in over 70 UN member states across 5 policy areas. To begin, I would like to kind of situate our work in the broader framework of the compact, its cross-cutting principle of gender responsiveness, and its review process. So concrete steps towards a monitoring and evaluation framework for the GCM emerged in the context of the 2022 IMRF. And I want to be clear here. So when the compact was established, there was no monitoring and evaluation framework in place. In the then adopted, so 2022 adopted Progress Declaration, a request for a proposal to develop a limited set of indicators that draws on the global indicator framework for the SDGs and the targets of the 2030 Agenda was issued to the UN Secretary General. And the idea behind this limited set of indicators was to assist member states upon their request in conducting inclusive reviews of progress related to the implementation of the GCM. As well as to include a comprehensive strategy for improving disaggregated migration data. So subsequently, the UN Network on Migration established a work stream and held regional and global consultations on GCM indicators. They were ultimately published in 2024. The set consists of 27 core indicators and 83 additional indicators. 8 core indicators and 24 additional indicators are specifically tied to the gender responsiveness principle. But before the development of the GCM indicators was the development of the Gender Migration Index, or the GMI. Indeed, and my colleague Younous brought in the importance of academics in this process as well. What motivated me to develop the indicator system was the absence of an existing monitoring and evaluation framework ahead of the first International Migration Review Forum. As I asked myself, how are we supposed to review the implementation of the GCM without an existing framework, or is there a framework to be created? And I took on this task by creating the Gender Migration Index, with a focus on the needs and challenges of women, girls, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants through a comprehensive indicator system that centers migrants' lived experiences through participatory action research. And I want to stress this here. So our index is co-curated in its methodology, and it results in various outputs such as the gender snapshots that we're launching in the context of the second International Migration Review Forum. It highlights overall gender responsiveness as well as specific policy-specific gender responsiveness along a traffic light system of limited, moderate, and extensive attention to gender dynamics in migration. The index is versatile in its application, so we've applied it in the context of the Global Compact for Migration, but also in the context of UN treaty body reviews, such as for CEDAW and the Committee on Migrant Workers. So it works in different contexts. In the context of the GCM, we used member states' voluntary national reviews as the main reference point, as they serve to demonstrate progress in the implementation of the GCM, and they're produced by states themselves to show how they have progressed with regards to the implementation of the GCM. So here's what we found from our analysis from the 2022 IMRF and the VNRs that were submitted for that. So this is the baseline for our gender snapshots by region. And what we found is a lot of red, and if you recall the traffic light system, that means a lot of limited gender responsive implementation. Let's begin with Africa. And rather than analyzing these slides in depth, again, this is being published in the context of the IMRF that is happening right now. I will share one key pattern because I believe this speaks volumes by themselves, and the countries are ranked top to bottom. So for Africa, a key pattern to observe is that although the overall levels of gender responsiveness in the implementation of the compact might appear promising for some countries, this is not necessarily reflected in specific policy areas. And this is because we found significant add-on language that maybe other colleagues know all too well, in the sense of mixing gender dynamics into the document without specifics on how they're actually being engaged with or considered in targeted policy areas. And this trend we also saw in the context of the Arab states as defined by the UN. We see similar pattern here. However, what stands out is the near absence of gender responsive implementation, for instance, in the education sector, a main space for social cohesion. In Asia Pacific, we also see these patterns, and as in the other two regions, they similarly emerge here with the note that in this context, the gender responsive implementation of the compact in terms of addressing gender-based violence was particularly limited. And then in the final two regions, Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in what we call Europe Plus, so UNECE, overall levels of gender responsiveness in the implementation of the compact appeared promising in several selected countries, but with change in political leadership, this progress has been stalled. And this is the case, as we found, for Argentina, for instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Germany in Europe, for example. So following these baseline gender snapshots, again, they're based on the 2022 VNRs that were submitted. We have now begun our process of analyzing the VNRs that were submitted for 2026 to see where the progress is at. And we've started this progress, and I would like to give due consideration and thanks to colleague Snehal Dote next to me, who has been spearheading the efforts with regards to this. We see uneven implementation. And so what we did for now is look at the countries that were lowest performing based on our index analysis of the 2022 VNRs and the availability of the 2026 VNRs at the time when we conducted the analysis. So again, these are the comparisons of the lowest performing countries and in relation to the VNRs that were already published at the time when we did this. What we see is some progress for Chad, Morocco, and Uruguay. However, in Uzbekistan, for instance, we see regression, and the same for the Netherlands, we see a stalling. Gender responsiveness was limited in 2022, and we haven't seen any because it's remained the same in this regard. For Uzbekistan, in 2022, there were some commitments made in terms of the gender responsive implementation ahead of the next International Migration Review Forum. We couldn't find them in the VNR. So we see that overall this is very limited. So as we continue to conduct these comparative assessments of the gender snapshots, we see patterns of unevenness in the implementation. And what is even more concerning is that this unevenness has not narrowed, it has actually deepened. Across countries, the progress is not linear. Some states, as mentioned, have advanced measurable improvements in gender responsive migration governance. Others have regressed or stalled implementation altogether, removing completely any reference to gender or related terminology around this, which is a very alarming trend that we see at the international level, unfortunately, unfolding. I would like to now focus on one particular country as kind of a case study to walk you through also how we apply the Gender Migration Index ultimately, and that is Germany. And so for Germany in 2022, we saw great visibility and attention paid to gender with explicit reference, for instance, to women and girls and all their diversity in migration, and that even being listed as a priority. We saw reference to gender responsive migration policies, gender disaggregated data, and targeted measures on labor migration, trafficking, inclusion, and health. However, when we then looked into the 2026 VNR, we see that Germany's VNR is more limited in its gender framing. And while it still mentions women in vulnerable situations and some gender-sensitive initiatives, gender is much less visible, especially as a cross-cutting lens. So we still see it referenced, but we don't see exactly how this is ultimately implemented across certain policy areas. And so Germany, in this sense, also lends itself as an important case study for the topic in terms of what we're discussing today on participatory approaches, because for the 2022 analysis that we conducted, we partnered with a local community-based migrant women-led organization for the Gender Migration Index analysis to have a better sense, again, of the lived realities of migrant women in the implementation of the compact. And so to demonstrate this, we will share some of the findings there. And these findings will also give you a sense of the template that we're using, that our colleagues are ultimately filling out, and how we're conducting our trainings for the Gender Migration Index. And these reflect, this was done in the context of labor. And as mentioned, this is what our templates look like for the organizations to fill out in collaboration with us after having received training and applying the Gender Migration Index. So according to our colleagues, migrant women moderately access resources and services, but only access information and accountability mechanisms in limited ways. In terms of resources, for example, the organization pointed to two key concerns: the lack of consideration of intersectionality and limited access altogether to resources. These two chief concerns were also reflected in terms of what kind of services, migrant women access. And of note here is the discrimination faced by the very institutions providing the essential services when it comes to labor market participation, such as job centers, for instance, de-skilling migrant women into labor sectors where there is a particular need, rather than meeting them in terms of where their actual qualifications are at. For the next two indicators, information and accountability, our colleagues reported limited engagement. As it relates to information, this takes the form of migrant women generally having limited knowledge or awareness of their rights, and the fact that anti-discrimination politics in the country are fragmented as best. And with that, I would just like to leave you, in fact, and this is reflected in the accountability piece as well, that many of the migrant women, when they experienced discrimination and trying to access the labor market, were unsure where to go. and also had significant fear in terms of retaliation in case they were reporting discrimination, for instance. So let me leave you with an invitation to join us in the application of the Gender Migration Index as we are continuing with our analyses of the 2026 VNRs. So similar to our colleagues from the Clinique Hijra, we have a model in place, and we're now like to, of course, expand it so we can provide this comprehensive gender snapshot again when we meet next for the upcoming International Migration Review. And our partner trainings are regularly available, and we've had great success with them. And with this, I would just like to say thank you again. And yes, here are just some reflections from some of the partners that we've trained using the Gender Migration Index and their experiences there. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lara, for that wonderful presentation. Super interesting and useful, the Gender Migration Index. And I, in fact, would love to contribute to the application at some point here in Mexico. With that
There we
said,
go.
Yes.
Got one.
There we go. We need more.
We need more.
Yes.
We have questions.
Thank you so much. I'll have my closing remarks just at the end of the session. Ambi is next up. Ambi, please go ahead with your presentation. You have 10 to 12 minutes, and we already have one question in the chat. And if anybody else in the audience would like to pose a question, please feel free in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. Thank you to co-organizers, especially Dr. Lara Suzanne, for bringing us all together for this important discussion in the context of the IMRF. Talking about participatory approaches, I would just like to say, like, I don't have a US visa, right? So for me to actually join and present, it wouldn't have been possible if we wouldn't have really thought of like having a virtual conversation. So I feel like if you want to do it, you can do it. And so, yes, I'm really grateful to join this conversation online. It was very insightful to learn from everybody who spoke before me. And so being the final speaker, certainly it's a tough task to follow. So I'm speaking today from the perspective of the work that we're doing at MYCP, which is Migration, Youth and Children Platform, and specifically the committee that I'm on, which is a youth committee on migration and displacement, displacement data. I'm also very happy to be joined by my fellow committee team member and chair, Laura Coburn, in the room, and also Yashiba. They're attending this in person. So the focus of my presentation today will be that how participatory data approaches can strengthen migration governance across intersectional lived experiences and with particular focus to children and youth on the move. The central point that I want to raise, honestly, is simple. The data innovation is honestly not about having better data sets, better indicators, or more sophisticated dashboards, Those are important, of course. But the more fundamental question is that who gets to define what counts as evidence? For youth and children, this question is very urgent. Because young migrants are often counted in migration systems, but they are not always heard in the design of those systems. They appear as numbers, categories, vulnerability, precarious population, or as future labor market actors. But they are rarely positioned as knowledge producers or right holders or as stakeholders in migration governance. So today I want to suggest that we take a shift from this narrative, from children and youth to just being counted as numbers, being impacted, to children and youth helping shape the evidence that informs the review process, that informs policy, and that informs accountability. So with this, why does it matter really at this point when we have all joined for the IMRF? See, this matters at the IMRF because the Global Compact for Migration since 2018 has already given us an important opening. The GCM is built around a whole of society approach, and I think I will really agree with one of the conclusions that the shadow report of the Hijra Foundation, like the report sort of said that it's a whole society approach, but really on paper, but it is more guided by institutional lens. And so with that, definitely the GCM recognizes something called a whole of society, but it recognizes that migration governance cannot just be carried by states alone. It requires civil society, it requires local authorities, migrant organizations, researchers in academia and beyond, communities and affected groups. But see, there is this gap between this principle that the GCM has envisioned and how the review process actually work in practice. And many monitoring and review process remain institutionally driven and indicator focused. It has become more of a checklist process at this point. And so migrants, including young migrants, may be consulted at different processes, but they're often, they remain an afterthought, and they just usually come after main questions are answered, and they're usually put into categories, and often come after priorities have been set by member states. So participation in data collection, sure, but then what? Too often it is late, it is limited, and it is extractive. This is why I feel that IMRF is not only a space to review progress, it's a 4-year check in, but it's also a space to ask whose knowledge actually shapes the practice. If the evidence used to access implementation does not really reflect lived realities, then our review process is really becoming technically impressive, but it is becoming politically incomplete. And so the spreadsheet, I feel that it might really look neat as member states will be presenting it, but in reality of a polycrisis that we all live in right now, the lived realities are far behind. And so, sorry. Yeah. So participatory data governance requires a governance shift. And I would like to describe this shift in 3 ways: recognition, design, and accessibility. And what I mean by this is that participatory data changes recognition. It asks who is visible in our evidence system and who remains missing. Are we only seeing children enrolled in school, for instance, or are those excluded because of documentation, language, cost, discrimination, or fear of authorities? The second would be that participatory data, it also changes design. And by that, I mean that it asks questions that structure the data itself. So children and youth may prioritize things that institutions do not immediately see. And what are these things? These are the anxiety of navigating uncertain legal status, the humiliation of being denied access to services, the fear of seeking healthcare in a new country, or the everyday barriers hidden behind formal policy commitments. And third is participatory data changes accountability. It asks who can act on these findings. Evidence should not simply describe vulnerability, precarity, but it should identify who's responsible, what are the remedies, what does implementation look like, and what are the gaps behind these implementation. So my argument is this, that participation is not really an add-on to the data work that we do, but it is part of evidence infrastructure that we collect. And so with that, I would like to spotlight a work that we have been doing at MYCP and the committee that I'm part of. Our group got together to sort of do a scoping review of the GCM. Now, see, we are a team of 5 young women with different backgrounds. Yet we all have the experience of migration and mobility in our lives. And that is something that unites us and brings us together on this committee. And as the Youth Committee on Migration and Displacement Data, we assessed how children and youth are represented across GCM using the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child as a normative framework. So we looked at the 23 objectives and their action paragraphs, and we focused on 4 core UN CRC principles. Now, this is how it looked like. We focused on the principle of non-discrimination, the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival and development, and respect for the views of the child. But we did not simply read GCM in a general way. And I'm really going to get into the way our methodology was developed. We've developed structured analytical matrix. Each relevant paragraph and subparagraph was coded according to document reference and thematic category. So we identified what's the gap, what is the severity of this gap, and how does this correspond to each UNCRC principle, and how we went about taking analytical notes. The review was organized around 5 thematic areas. We had representation and participation of children and youth as the first one. The second one was legal and normative principles. The third, protection systems, implementation, accountability and financing. And lastly, intersectional and emerging themes. So the severity analysis was really important. We classified gaps as minor, moderate, and major. A minor gap basically meant that a principle or safeguard was present in GCM, but implementation details were weak or underdeveloped. A moderate gap meant that the issue was recognized, but the language was vague, weakly operationalized, or not supported by clear indicators. Or procedures. A major gap meant that a principle, protection, or participation was largely absent or it was vague. And serious implications, and this meant that there were serious implications for the rights and well-being of children and youth. Now, see, this matters because we are not only asking in our review that are children being mentioned, are youth being mentioned. Rather, we are asking, are children and youth recognized as right holders in this particular paragraph of the GCM that we're looking into? Are they protected through concrete mechanisms? Are they able to influence decisions? Are there monitoring tools, financing commitments, and accountability structures to make all of these rights really real? Or else it's just another UN document. The process was also peer-led. It was collective. The committee divided coding responsibilities across objectives, and then we cross-reviewed each other's entries. This helped strengthen consistency, a chance to also be reflexive, which we often forget in data collection process, I must say, reduce individual bias, improve alignment across categories, including the UNCRC principles, and also assess again what do we really mean by our severity ratings. So this is really important for today's discussion because it shows what youth-led evidence can look like, how we really get on when we get to work. And it is not just about testimony of this is what we have done, but it is also to say that youth voice is not really decoration. It can really be grounded in evidence, systematic, and it can be analytical and also policy relevant. So what did we find? This is what we found. The core finding of the review is that commitments are not enough. Across GCM, children and youth are frequently acknowledged, but their rights are not systematically translated into safeguards or participatory mechanism. Participation is recognized in principle, but it is weakly operationalized. The best of interest of the child are affirmed in practice, but they're not translated into clear procedures. So we don't really who is doing what, when, and how. Commitments are made, but the question of resourcing is often left vague. This is where MYCP's broader message for IMRF becomes really clear, that this IMRF must close the gap between the so-called global commitments and the lived reality of young migrants on the move. Because rights that exist only in language of global agreements, but not in the system of access, protection, they actually just remain inaccessible in practice. Visible is not really same as enable. And I think hearing the presentations before, I do feel that all our findings are really relevant in that regard. And so intersectional lived reality really becomes a question, right? Like how can you have intersectional lived experience as a data question? See, intersectional is not really a new word, right? Like it has been thrown around since 80s and 90s in different policy documents. And intersectionality then is not just like a policy preference or a theoretical preference or a word to just include to sound inclusive. But I feel that it's also an epistemological question. By that, I mean that it really questions us that how do we really know what we know? And so children and youth are not a homogeneous single category. Age intersects with migration status, it intersects with gender, disability, race, caste, language, family separation, labor conditions, climate exposure, documentation, and honestly, it's more. And for example, I can tell you that a young documented migrant trying to access school faces different set of barriers. An accompanied child with disability would face another. A young woman needing sexual and reproductive health care will face something else. And so you cannot just plug all of this together as youth and children need so and so. So if our data systems treat children or youth as one flat category, these differences disappear. And on this, I would also like to say that in my own PhD work, I look at platform economy and gig work. And what tech platforms tend to do is that they flatten the identity. You don't really know who is delivering your orders, right? And this is the same thing that is happening with the datafication of real lives. And this is something that participatory data can sort of help to navigate by asking who is missing, which barriers accumulate, how do experiences across different categories really reflect what evidences do young migrants themselves consider important. And with that, I would like to just talk about what are our priorities then at IMRF. So from MYCP's perspective, the priority at the IMRF is to move migration governance in a direction that is youth-centered, rights-based, and most importantly, implementation-driven. There are four broad categories of concern. The first is access, the second is protection, and the third is emerging risk and accountability. The primary ask is that young people are not just recognized as stakeholders within GCM, but their participation is institutionalized, it's resourced and embedded across different stages of policy making and implementation. And so in other words, youth participation should not only depend on whether a young person is invited on a panel, but it should rather be built in the system of what really happens after that panel discussion. With that, I would like to say that what can youth-led evidence really reveal? Youth-led evidence does not simply add stories to an existing data. Let's add qualitative research to a quantitative desk data set. It identifies implementation gaps that administrative data often misses. So in education, for instance, young people have highlighted barriers linked to documentation, school fees, language certification, and recognition of prior learning. A child may technically have the right to education, but if they cannot really enroll or sit in an exam, then the rights remain incomplete. I will wrap up in a minute now. And so with that, I would like to sort of just talk about that what participatory data should look like instead. It should move from consultation to co-creation with young people. It should use child-friendly and youth-responsive methods that I've talked about. It should track right outcomes and not demographic categories. We do not need to be additive at this point. It must take data ethics seriously. It should create feedback loops. And finally, it must be funded. IMRF entry points, I would say, identifies a whole of society approach, but probably it looks like this by institutionalizing youth participation across different dynamics. And lastly, I would say that we do not want symbolic, youth inclusion. We want because young people are already shaping up migration process. I feel like governance should catch up. And with that, I would just like to end with this food for thought question that when children and youth are excluded from defining evidence, whose realities are migration governance systems actually measuring? And for me, this is the question which is at the heart of today's discussion. And I thank you all for your time and engagement.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ambi, for that wonderful presentation as well. Thank you indeed to our entire panel. It was a phenomenal experience to hear each of you. You've demonstrated that meaningful migrant participation in the gathering, interpretation, use, and reporting of data is not simply a matter of inclusion, right? But a transformative approach to governance that recognizes migrants as producers of knowledge whose lived experiences are essential indeed for shaping more equitable, accountable, and responsive policies and institutions. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass on to the question and answer part of the session. We have one question posed in the chat, which reads as follows. Is the implementation of the GCM compatible with a security-oriented approach that many countries are adopting in migration management? And I will cede that on to the entire panel. Whoever would like to respond, please go ahead. We have about 7 minutes left, so if you could keep your comments a bit brief, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I can keep it very brief. No. If you wanted a brief answer, I would say to me, no. I think there's certainly a tension of with what dedicated individuals such as the ones in the room and online that are doing this work are doing, and the barriers that we're facing in terms of where the rhetoric, not only the rhetoric, where the operationalization of much of this is going, unfortunately, at this point. But throughout my experience here at the IMRF for the second time, I like to always keep reminding myself that it is a multi-stakeholder process that we're talking about. So even if we might see regression from some stakeholders, we as civil society can keep the line and keep trying to at least move towards progress where we can, such as through these participatory approaches. So that would be my response. I would be curious to hear from my colleagues as well of whether they see a tension there, how we can overcome it, and what our role is if we want to phrase it in that way.
Yeah. If I may add something in that regard, I think question by Maimar Ramdani is very interesting because, in fact, it invites us to recall that the GCM has three dimensions. The human rights dimension and the management dimension. The third one, I forgot it. Anyway, there are two, the human rights one and the management dimension. And I think that the security-oriented approach by states fits in the management dimension because it gives states, and also international law gives states, the right to control their borders. But luckily, the GCM also says that the management dimension should be implemented in conformity with the human rights dimension. So if states only focus on a security-oriented approach, it is not in line with the GCM. They should also take into account the human rights dimension so that their policies can be based also on human rights.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much. We do indeed have another question. I'm not sure, Lara, you tell me. Do we have time for another
Yes,
question?
I think, and we also started a little late, so unless anyone urgently, maybe, yes.
So I'll go ahead and read the question from Sarah Soto. Where do participatory processes tend to lose traction when interfacing with state institutions, and what has worked in practice to embed them in ways that genuinely preserve community agency?
Maybe I can come in here.
Please, I was hoping you would.
No, but just briefly, I mean, we have to be a bit cheeky with all these difficult questions. But I think on this one, what I've learned is the timing of participatory approaches also matters, right? I mean, one of the things we try to do with our participatory urban planning forums is to have that space for dialogue and to have a space that we convene where municipalities meet with migrants, displaced communities, and together shape data and shape priorities. Now, how they influence policy, how they influence state institutions is a matter of timing. So right now, I'll give you a very concrete example. We're leading these dialogues in Ethiopia, and our colleagues in Ethiopia told us, let's push for more dialogues in the next few weeks because we have elections coming up. And right now, state institutions are listening to us. So let's push, let's advocate, let's increase the momentum, because whatever we're going to ask for them now, they're going to be more likely to say yes and put some of our demands for services locally into practice. So let's basically push them. It's a bit of this negotiation, this political negotiation that you can get through participatory processes. It's instrumentalizing to some extent the process itself, but it is an advocacy process. So I think part of how you, to answer your question, is how to use these participatory methods and spaces as spaces for advocacy, policy influence, and policy commitments from state institutions. So we've learned that one way to do that is to really try to time in with electoral processes, for example.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Nassim. Would anybody else like to comment on that question? Or if not, we can go ahead and wrap up.
I think I would like to add.
Okay, go ahead, Nadia.
So I think it's a very important question, and it also, I think I am seeing it from 3 points actually. See, they lose traction the moment when communities are invited also too late on the table. So they are also often invited after agendas are set, after indicators are set. And so I feel like often communities are invited too late. Second, I also feel that, they lose traction when lived experience sort of becomes like it's translated into bureaucratic categories, and I feel like that's also where, it stops communities to really shape that translation process. I'm thinking it from this lens that, for example, youth and children may describe insecurity, such as in terms of like fear or like being excluded. But then the thing is that there are no bureaucratic categories to define emotions and processes. And so that's where I feel like, it loses traction. And I think finally is also that there is no feedback loop usually in participation process, and I think that's really important, and communities often feel disrespected because they are just invited at consultation phases and then nothing really happens after that. So I think these are at least 3 things on top of my mind where I feel like it loses traction. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel and for those wonderful responses, and also to
Brandon?
and Sarah for their response. Go ahead.
Brandon, sorry, I tried to raise my hand
Oh,
at
go
least
ahead.
with the panel there. I would just like to add one more component about time, which is participatory approaches take time in general, which means the timing is the more important. And so I think maybe just from our own experience, some of the, I guess a component to consider there is not only like when might it be politically particularly important to do these or to have the participatory component in place, but also when we're looking at it as a 4-year span of the GCM, for instance, where might we see this as like, when do we start it? Do we include it, for instance, in the regional reviews that are taking place in the 2-year span? Within that, are we just preparing for the 4 years, et cetera? So I think there's the timing question is a really, really important one. And then wanted to emphasize again what Ambi was mentioning, that it doesn't stop there. It does not stop just by having those, for instance, with our indicator, having the organizations fill out the templates, but what follows after, right? How do we still ensure that the participation continues? And the way that we've set up the index is actually that we're hoping to go back to the partners that we've already have, and then to say, here, now we're looking at the review yet again. Would you like to participate? And actually also for them to have an assessment of how things might have changed, right? That's another, actually, that's feedback that we've received, is that some of these approaches and the inclusion in these broader processes has also allowed the organizations themselves to reflect of what are their main challenges at this particular point in time, and how do they align with what we see in migration governance. So I just wanted to add that component in terms of the timing being really crucial here.
No, beautiful. That's a very important point.
And my colleague next to me, yes, on timing.
Yes, it's very brief. I would like to stress again that it is important that donor organizations take into account the fact that they need to stimulate such inclusive data collection also in the project's defense in order to enable an inclusive, because there is a willingness, but sometimes because of lack of funding, lack of expertise, civil society organizations, especially migrant-led organizations, cannot participate effectively. And Heinrich Ball is one of the good examples which supported our project in Morocco. And I think that other donors could also include the GCM in the project defense, so that civil society can protect. Last point, I see one of my master students from Ghana completing me, in fact, of correcting me. The third dimension of the GCM is the sustainable development. Thank you, Friedrich.
There you go. We love grad students and those that can continue to keep us updated. No, thank you indeed to our entire panel. It was a remarkable honor to be here with you all and hear on your reflections and your individual projects. Thank you to Umaimi and Sarah as well for posing those very important questions in the chat. To all those who participated in today's session. Effectively today, we are reminded that participatory data is not only a technical tool, but is also a democratic process, and practice that can reshape and transform how migration governance is designed, implemented, and evaluated. With Dr. Nassim, we heard about how municipalities and cities in contexts like Afghanistan, Uganda, and Kenya are often where migration governance becomes more tangible, right? From social cohesion to displacement and return processes. And that governance becomes more effective when migrants help define what data matters in their own lives based on their own lived experience. Dr. Younous, Arbaoui, Melissa, Drost, and Alice Wong challenged us to think about how participatory review processes can transform the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration from a reporting exercises into a more lived, accountable, and inclusive process. Dr. Lara here, based on her own experience developing the Gender and Migration Index and also the Global Gender and Migration Snapshots, highlighted how more nuanced and intersectional approaches can help identify uneven implementation of gender-responsive migration governance across countries and regions. And I would like to repeat the call, for more support in the application of those tools in different contexts. And be powerfully center the experiences of children and youth on the move, reminding us that young people are too often viewed only as future labor actors or beneficiaries, rather than as rights holders and legitimate contributors to governance processes and evidence production. So the conversation pushed us, to reflect further on deeper questions around what I'm personally interested into is the idea of intersectionality, right? How do we capture data, use data, and report data with an intersectional approach? It's not anything that's very easy, but it's certainly something that we heard about today, from different populations, including youth and such. And also how it's an epistemological challenge to think about how we can better understand what we actually know or don't know, and kind of question at a more epistemological level what lived experience can inform, right? Across all of these interventions, a common thread has emerged, in fact, around migration data systems and how they are often good at counting people, but far less equipped to understand trust, belonging, exclusion, access to services, and the lived realities behind mobility trajectories, right? So the individual lived experience, of course, should always inform what policy design looks like and how policy is implemented and evaluated across time. A key takeaway for me personally is that participatory approaches strengthen trust, accountability, and institutional responsiveness, particularly when they create sustained platforms, right? Not a one-off event, but rather a long-term engagement with migrants and civil society organizations that accompany them for dialogue and co-design between governments, civil society, academia, municipalities, and many other actors. Today's conversation essentially challenges us to see migrants not merely as beneficiaries or respondents, but as knowledge producers, analysts, and agents of change whose expertise is essential for more inclusive governance, right? As we move toward future review and follow-up processes under the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, the challenge ahead is not simply to collect more data, in fact, but to build systems that listen more deeply, represent people more fully, and translate lived experience into meaningful policy action. So with that said, I would like to thank again the entire panel for your beautiful remarks, the powerful work that each of you are doing in your respective contexts, as well as the entire audience for your participation, and to Laura, who I know back from grad school. This is an enormous honor and treat for me to be in dialogue with you and your colleagues. So thank you once again. May you all have a beautiful day, and thank you. Take care.